Now, speaking of infrastructure, let's focus on East Africa very briefly. It's absolutely no secret that the region's poor infrastructure, you name it, road, rail, air links, the lot, that poor infrastructure is a significant impediment to doing business in the region. Take electricity costs, for example. A unit of power over here costs anywhere between 18 to 22 US cents on average, and it's not always available. Ethiopia, right next door, can sell electricity at 5 US cents per kilowatt hour. Now, to build the rail links that are planned across the region, over $30 billion is required, and public funds cannot provide all of it. As I found out earlier on, the problem, though, isn't a lack of private capital. The capital is there. It's a lack of sensible ways to invest it in infrastructure.
But I think the issue has been the regulatory regime around investing into infrastructure as an asset class. Because as an example, for insurance companies, it would not be allowed as an admitted asset, meaning that it would not count for purposes of solvency and capital, and you would then be penalized for effecting an infrastructure investment, relative to a T-bill or a deposit where you would not be penalized. I think the same thing goes for pension funds, where infrastructure is not an explicitly allowed asset class. For a pension fund to invest in infrastructure, it has to get a written approval from its board of trustees, from the regulator in this case, which then removes the discretion from an asset manager or the fund from then investing into.
So when you talk about the regulator for pensions, that's RBA? That's
the RBA. Yeah. So some people do see that as a hindrance, but if that could be provided for as an asset class, then investors, asset managers and pension fund trustees would have the discretion to invest into infrastructure in the same way that they invest in any other asset class. And for insurance companies, they would not be required to hold capital against an infrastructure asset. If those kinds of things were removed, I sense that you would easily unlock another 5 to 10% of that $50 billion, which is about $5 billion to then move into infrastructure.
That figure is pretty interesting. $5 billion is, well, to use a simple example, that's more than what we borrowed for the first phase of the standard gauge rail line.
Absolutely. And if you do look at other countries, places like South Africa, Europe and the US, it is pension funds that have funded the construction of roads, bridges, hospitals, and so on and so forth. So I do not see why that model cannot also be applied here in East Africa.
The money can come in, but then how do we structure it? Do we need to start setting up perhaps specific classes of asset-backed securities that people can then buy into, perhaps as a method of making it a lot easier to actually democratize the ability to raise capital?
One way is certainly an asset-backed security, where we can then be able to structure the infrastructure assets to then generate some income, either monthly or quarterly, semi-annually, or whatever it is. That income can be securitized and sold off to a pension fund to then obviously invest as an asset. And a good example is something like a toll road or a port, as an example. So I think those are the kind of things that can happen. And for pension funds and insurance companies, they are looking for long-term assets to then match against their liabilities. And I think an infrastructure asset really would be the way to go. We've also had, obviously, the examples of the PPP framework. I think at present, if you look at a place like East Africa, we have more than 58 licensed and approved PPP projects to the tune of about $7 billion. But they are fairly cumbersome, they are a bit unwieldy, and they have not been, I guess, the best way to actually mobilize this local institutional money to then participate in public projects.
One last question, and we like asking fund managers this every time they're on the set. You've got $100 million in your hand, hypothetical monopoly money. But where would you put it if you're actually going to invest in infrastructure in East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda? Where would you put that cash?
My sense is that if I was going to do infrastructure, it would be just around, I'll be very keen on roads, and I think road concessions. We simply need roads that connect the city from north, not the city, but the country from north to south and east to west, and then set up all the grids alongside that. I think that would make a significant difference. If I had money as well to invest in infrastructure, I would certainly then invest in a deep harbor port, similar to what they want to do in Lamu, allow ships to actually come all the way into the harbor, offload their containers and move off, hopefully within a matter of days and not the weeks that we've been talking about, and then expand the airport and then set up the second runway.